A boy sells his favorite toy airplane to help his sick mother. When the toy ends up in the hands of a famous former pilot, he is shocked to see that the plane. Noah was sitting on the floor of his small room, surrounded by toys that, until then, had filled his afternoons with joy. But that day nothing seemed right. The air was heavy, weighed down by the silent worry that hung over the house. He looked at his favorite toy airplane, an old metal model he had received as a gift for his last birthday. It was more than just a toy, it was the symbol of his greatest dream, to become a pilot one day and touch the clouds. But now, faced with the seriousness of his mother's illness, even that dream seemed distant, almost unreachable. On the other side of the slightly open door, Noah could hear his mother's faint breathing. She was lying on the small living room sofa, covered by a blanket that looked old and worn just like her. The medicines were expensive, the doctor's visits had become increasingly spaced out, and the family's savings were nearly gone. The situation was desperate, but Noah, only 10 years old, knew he had to do something. He closed his eyes and clutched the airplane to his chest, fighting back the tears that insisted on falling. He walked hesitantly down the stairs and found his mother with her eyes closed, her face pale and tired. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Slowly he approached, feeling his heart tighten in his chest. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he said, trying to control the tremor in his voice. She slowly opened her eyes and smiled at him, a fragile smile but full of love. "What is it, my love?" she asked, weakly but with all her usual tenderness. Noah sat beside her, holding the toy airplane firmly. "I'm going to sell my airplane," he said all at once, as if saying it quickly would make it hurt less. His mother looked at him, surprised but too weak to argue. She knew how much that toy meant to her son, how much he dreamed of becoming a pilot someday. "No, you don't have to do this," she murmured with difficulty. But he shook his head, determined. "I have to, Mom. We don't have any more money and you need to get treatment." The silence that followed was painful. Noah felt like his heart was being shattered into 1,000 pieces. His mother raised her trembling hand and caressed the boy's face, her eyes full of tears she could barely hold back. "You are so brave, my son, so brave," she whispered as he held her hand, feeling the fragile and cold skin against his own. They stayed there together in silence, each trying to cope with the pain of the moment in the best way they could. Noah was sitting on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the toy airplane in his hands. The soft evening light came through the window, gently illuminating the worn-out metal, every detail of the airplane reflecting years of imaginary adventures. He closed his eyes for a moment, allowing his mind to drift back to the days when he piloted that airplane in the clouds of his imagination, without worries, without fear. It was just him, the wind, and the sky. But now, those adventures seemed further away than ever, almost as if they belonged to another life. As his fingers traced the fuselage of the toy, Noah remembered all the times he imagined flying on dangerous missions, saving the world, exploring distant horizons. He could still hear the sound of the spinning propellers in his mind, feel the imaginary wind hitting his face. But now that toy carried a different weight. He knew that by letting it go, he was giving up a part of himself. The decision to sell the airplane had already been made, but that didn't make the goodbyes any easier. On the other side of the hallway, his mother watched him. Wrapped in the thin blanket, her silhouette seemed even more fragile than usual. She saw Noah with the airplane in his hands and knew what it meant to him. She wanted to say something, to try to stop him, but the words were caught in her throat. All she could do was watch in silence, her heart breaking a little more with every glance she cast at her son. It was as if she knew that his sacrifice, although noble, was too great for someone so young. Noah, for his part, was determined. He held the toy up in the air, spinning it as he did when pretending to fly, the sound of the imaginary engine escaping from his lips. "Come on, Commander Noah, cruising altitude reached, strong winds ahead, but nothing we can't overcome," he murmured to himself, trying to recapture some of the joy that the airplane had always brought him. But something was different. The emptiness growing inside him could no longer be ignored. Even so, he refused to cry. Not now. He had a job to do, a mission far more important than any imaginary flight, to help his mother. And even if it meant giving up his dream, he would do it without hesitation. But, no matter how hard he tried to convince himself that he was doing the right thing, the weight of his choice tightened in his chest. He knew that the airplane would be just an object from that moment on, a memory to be left behind. With a sigh, Noah placed the airplane on the floor and slowly stood up. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself were fighting against him. He looked around the room one last time, as if wanting to engrave in his memory the moments he had spent there, flying on his solitary missions. The silence of the house only made the moment harder. The absence of sound seemed to echo his own loneliness. "Are you okay, son?" His mother's weak voice finally broke the silence. Noah turned around, surprised to see her standing, leaning against the doorframe. She looked weaker than ever, but her eyes were fixed on the toy at the boy's feet. He swallowed hard, trying to hide the pain in his gaze. "Yes, Mom. Everything's going to be okay. I promise," he replied, even though he knew those words were more for himself than for her. His mother tried to smile, but the smile faded before it could fully form. She knew that Noah was growing up too fast, that this decision was the weight of the world on his small shoulders. "I'm sorry, Noah," she whispered, but he shook his head before she could continue. "No, Mom. You don't have to apologize. I'm doing this for you." And in that moment, the strength he showed made her eyes fill with tears. Noah crouched down again and picked up the airplane from the floor, wiping away the invisible dust that seemed stubbornly stuck to the wings. He held it against his chest for another second, feeling the cold metal against his skin, and then, without looking back, took a step toward the door. His mother followed him with her gaze, too weak to stop him, knowing that, despite everything, Noah was about to make the biggest sacrifice of his young life. When Noah walked through the door, the sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. He walked slowly, holding the airplane tightly against his chest, as if he were still trying to absorb the last bit of courage that object gave him. But he knew that the time to say goodbye was near, and with it, the hope of a new beginning for his mother. The antique market was bustling that morning. The wooden stalls, piled with dusty objects and forgotten relics, seemed to tell stories of other lives. Noah walked slowly down the narrow aisles, holding his backpack with the toy airplane as if it were his last link to childhood. Each step he took felt heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his back. The vendors' shouts advertising their goods mingled with the distant sound of conversations, creating a chaotic yet familiar environment. Noah had passed through there with his mother on better days, but today that place had a different purpose. He stopped in front of one of the stalls, where an old man with disheveled white hair watched him with a curious look. "Can I help you, boy?" asked the man, adjusting his glasses. Noah took off his backpack, hesitant, and removed the toy airplane, placing it carefully on the counter. "I want to sell this," he said, his voice low, almost inaudible. The man looked at the toy with indifference, adjusted his glasses once more, and then grimaced. "This isn't worth much, you know? Maybe $5 at most?" Noah's heart sank. He knew the airplane was worth more, perhaps not financially but emotionally. Even so, he forced a smile and thanked the man. He picked up the airplane again and continued walking through the market, his eyes wandering among the stalls, trying to find someone who could see value in what he was offering. Each rejection felt like a stab in his chest. He felt the weight of his decision growing, time running out, and his mother waiting at home, unaware of what the boy was doing to help her. It was then, in the farthest corner of the market, that Noah spotted a tall man in a leather jacket, with gray hair, standing silently in front of a stall filled with old watches. The man seemed distant, almost out of place in that noisy environment, as if he were there, but at the same time, lost in thought. Something about him caught Noah's attention. Maybe it was the tired look in his eyes, or the way he gazed at the objects around him, as if searching for something he couldn't quite identify. Noah approached, hesitant, and stopped beside the man. "Excuse me, sir, are you interested in airplanes?" The man, who seemed immersed in his own thoughts, turned slowly, his eyes focusing on the boy. For a second, he said nothing, simply observing Noah with curiosity, as if trying to understand why this child had approached him. Then he looked at the airplane in Noah's hands, and for a brief moment, his eyes shone with something the boy couldn't quite grasp. "Let me see," said the man with a hoarse but gentle voice. Noah handed him the airplane, feeling a bit nervous. The man held the toy with unexpected delicacy, as if handling something fragile and precious. His fingers moved over the surface of the airplane, his eyes examining every detail, every scratch, as if it held some greater significance for him. "How much do you want for it?" he asked without taking his eyes off the toy. Noah hesitated for a moment. He knew that any amount would be insufficient for what it represented. I just need money to help my mother. She's sick and we don't have any more resources." The words came out low, but filled with an honesty that touched something deep within the man. He took a deep breath, feeling a weight in his chest that he didn't fully understand. "And how much is it worth to you?" asked Richard, now looking directly into Noah's eyes. "It's worth my life, but hers is worth more," replied Noah, with a maturity that surprised the former pilot. Silence lingered for a moment as Richard pondered what that meant. He knew the value of a sacrifice. He knew what it meant to give up something you love for a greater good. And in that moment, something inside him changed. He pulled out a large bill from his pocket, an amount that Noah never expected to receive. "This should be enough," Richard said, extending his hand to the boy, who looked at the money, confused and emotional. Without knowing what to say, Noah accepted the money and handed over the airplane. As he walked away, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The sense of loss was still there, but he knew he had done the right thing. What he didn't know was that, by leaving the airplane in Richard's hands, he was starting a chain of events that would change their lives forever. Richard's apartment was a reflection of the man he had become. Silent, lonely, filled with memories he preferred to forget. The white, empty walls contrasted with the dark, austere furniture. The atmosphere was cold, as if time had stopped there. Sitting in his worn leather armchair, Richard held the toy airplane he had bought from Noah. His fingers ran over the cold metal surface, and something inside him felt dormant, on the verge of awakening. For a moment, he closed his eyes and was transported back to the days when flying was his life. He remembered the feel of the firm grip of the control stick in his hands, the powerful sound of the propellers cutting through the wind, and the endless horizon before him. But along with those memories came the ghost, the accident, the abrupt end of his career, the doors that had closed forever, both in the sky and in his life. Since then, Richard had isolated himself, trying to bury his past, but that simple toy airplane now seemed to bring everything back to the surface. He turned the toy in his hands, examining every detail with care. It was a simple model, but something about it felt special. Richard wondered what it was about that small piece of metal that bothered him so much. It wasn't just nostalgia. There was something more, a connection he couldn't understand. The memories that surfaced weren't just about flying, but about loss, about sacrifice. And the more he thought about it, the more he felt that the airplane carried more than just a boy's dream. He got up from the armchair and walked to the window, still holding the airplane. Outside, the city carried on, indifferent to what was happening in his mind. The sounds of cars and honking barely reached his apartment high above, but he hardly paid attention. The sense of emptiness that always accompanied him seemed stronger that night. He looked at the airplane and wondered why, after so long, that simple toy affected him so deeply. "Why now?" he whispered to himself, as if expecting the toy to respond. Looking at his reflection in the window, Richard hardly recognized the man he saw. His gray hair, the face marked by time and the weight of his choices, everything seemed different from the confident pilot he once was. Life in the skies had been his only passion, and losing it had left him adrift. Maybe that was what connected him to the boy. He saw in Noah the same passion he once had, the same spark in his eyes. But there was something more, something he couldn't decipher. Richard sat back down, still holding the airplane in his hands. Now he felt that the toy was more than just a memory of the past. It carried a weight, an untold story. "Why does this affect me so much?" he murmured, almost unaware that he was speaking out loud. The airplane, which had once seemed like just an object, now pulsed in his hands as if it carried secrets, as if it had a story to unravel. And no matter how hard he tried to resist, he knew he had to find out why. The silence of the apartment became unbearable. Richard got up again, this time more agitated. He placed the airplane on the table and stared at it for a long time, as if expecting something to change. Curiosity gnawed at him, but the fear of reliving painful memories made him hesitate. "Where did you come from?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to the toy. He felt ridiculous talking to an object, but he couldn't deny the magnetism the airplane had over him. Sitting down again, Richard finally allowed himself to relax. His eyes examined every millimeter of the airplane, and something in his mind seemed to start making sense, as if pieces of a puzzle were beginning to fit together. He knew that strange feeling, that restlessness that had accompanied him since he bought the toy, wasn't for nothing. Something was about to be revealed, something he couldn't yet explain, but he knew would change everything. Unable to wait any longer, Richard picked up the airplane again and began to inspect it more carefully. It was as if an invisible force pushed him to do so. He ran his fingers along the fuselage, feeling every scratch, every mark. And it was at that moment that he noticed something different. A small, almost imperceptible line, as if there was a hidden compartment in the toy. Richard's heart began to race, and his hands trembled slightly. Richard could hardly believe what he was seeing. That seemingly simple and unremarkable toy airplane had a secret. As he handled it, he noticed the small line on the fuselage, almost invisible to the touch, but there it was, like a scar. With delicate care, He used his fingernail to open the compartment that had been sealed for decades. The lid clicked open with a slight snap, and Richard held his breath as he saw what was inside. An old piece of paper, yellowed with age, folded with care. He pulled out the letter from the compartment, feeling the rough texture of the paper against his fingers. Richard's heart began to beat faster, as if his body already knew that this discovery would change something deep inside him. Unfolding the letter carefully, his hands trembled slightly. The creases of the paper revealed a fine and meticulous handwriting, written with ink that, despite the years, was still legible. The first words of the letter immediately grabbed his attention. "My dear son." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. He took a deep breath, trying to process what was happening. It was as if, at that moment, time had stopped. Each word seemed to pulse with life as he read. The letter spoke of a man, a soldier who was thousands of miles from home, fighting for a future he might never see. But above all, that soldier regretted not having known his son. The weight of the words hit him hard. Richard, a man accustomed to facing life's hardships, felt an emotion he had long tried to bury. "I write this letter knowing that I may never be able to deliver it to you, but even from afar, I want you to know that I will always be by your side in some way." The words echoed in his mind. Each sentence seemed to resonate deeper and deeper in Richard, as if fate were playing a trick on him. He remembered his own story, everything he had lost, and the sacrifices he had made. There was something undeniably familiar in that letter, a connection he still couldn't fully understand. As he continued reading, Richard found himself immersed in the life of that soldier, as if he were there, writing the letter with trembling hands and a heavy heart. The war, the battles, the losses, and the uncertainty of a future that might never come. But the most painful thing was the love the soldier felt for the son he never met. "If you ever read these words, I hope you know that everything I did was for you. Even if we never met, you are my greatest hope." Richard paused, holding the letter on his lap, his gaze lost in the distance. That discovery had touched him in ways he didn't expect. He wondered how that toy airplane, something he had bought almost by chance, could hold such a deep, personal secret. Who was that soldier? Who was the son the letter was addressed to? And why, out of all people, had that airplane ended up in his hands? He felt it wasn't a coincidence. There was something bigger at play, something he still didn't understand. Continuing to read, he noticed that the letter was dated from World War II. The story unfolding in the soldier's words was tragic, but also full of love and sacrifice. The pain of a father who never had the chance to see his son grow up, but who, nevertheless, fought every day to ensure he had a future. Emotion began to take hold of Richard. He, a man who had faced so many battles in life, both in the air and on the ground, felt vulnerable in the face of those words. For a moment, he imagined himself in the place of that soldier, far from everything and everyone, facing the unknown and the fear of loss. Perhaps that's why the letter touched him so deeply. Perhaps it was because, in some way, he understood the weight of sacrifice and absence. He let the letter fall gently onto the table and looked at the toy airplane, now with different eyes. It was not just an old object. That airplane, which once belonged to Noah, carried not only the dream of a boy but also the story of a life cut short, of a love that had transcended time. Richard knew he couldn't simply ignore what he had just discovered. Something bigger was calling him and he couldn't turn back. Richard remained seated in his armchair, the letter still open on his knees. The silence filled the apartment, but in his mind, the past seemed to come alive. With each sentence he read, the soldier's story unfolded before his eyes. The man was young when he left for war, full of promises and hopes. But, throughout the letter, it became clear that he had lost much more than battles. He never returned home, never saw the son he so desperately wanted to meet. The mission he had embraced consumed his entire life. "I wanted so much to be there to see you grow, but duty called," Richard read, feeling a tightness in his chest. Those words carried a painful familiarity. It was as if he already knew that story. The sacrifice, the absence, the emptiness left behind. The soldier had given everything he had, with the hope that the son, whoever he was, would grow up in a better world. But fate had been relentless, and he never had the chance to embrace his son or tell him these words in person. As he delved into the final lines of the letter, Richard was overwhelmed by a strange feeling, an unsettling déjà vu. It was as if he had heard that story before, or perhaps lived something very similar. He tried to push the feeling away, but the more he read, the stronger it grew. The letter wasn't just a farewell from a father to an unknown son. It was a desperate cry from someone who knew his time was running out, but still carried hope. The soldier's name, signed hesitantly at the end of the letter, made Richard freeze. He stared at the letters as if they were impossible to read. It was a familiar name, something he couldn't immediately place, but it deeply disturbed him. His mind began to work frantically, trying to remember where he knew that name from. A chill ran down his spine. It was as if an old secret was about to be revealed, something that had always been there, but he had never known how to connect. Richard stood up, unable to remain seated. He walked around the apartment, the letter still in his hands, his heart racing. He read and reread the name, repeating it out loud, trying to force his mind to remember. Could it be? The idea seemed absurd, yet increasingly real as he tried to piece the puzzle together. His life, the toy airplane, the letter. Everything was connecting in a way he could never have foreseen. Standing by the window, Richard looked out at the city below, his thoughts racing. He remembered how his own career had been cut short by an accident, a tragedy that had taken him out of the skies forever. The guilt and emptiness that had followed him for years. And now, he held in his hands the story of another man who had also been torn away from his life, his family, by something greater than himself. The similarity was disturbing. He returned to the table, placed the letter in front of him, and for the first time in a long while, felt lost. There was something about that letter, about that soldier, that connected to his own journey, but he still couldn't see it clearly. The name, the airplane, the boy he had met at the market. Everything seemed to be intertwined by an invisible thread, something he would have to investigate further. The weight of the discovery left him breathless. It was as if a new truth was lurking, ready to reveal itself. And somehow he knew that the letter hadn't ended up in his hands by chance. Fate had placed that airplane in his path, and now, with the soldier's name echoing in his mind, Richard was ready to find out what else that old toy was hiding. Richard could no longer ignore the feeling that there was something bigger behind the letter. The soldier's name, which echoed in his mind, deeply troubled him. He knew it wasn't a coincidence. I will start translating the document. Given the context of the United States, I'll maintain the original formatting while adapting the translation accordingly. Sitting at his desk, the quiet apartment surrounding him, Richard began to search for clues. He picked up his phone and made the first of many calls. The goal was clear: to discover the identity of the man who had written such a letter, so full of love and despair. The first few days of research were frustrating. Richard searched military archives, attempting to access World War II records. Each page he turned seemed to bring more questions than answers. But then, one of the contacts he had made at a historical library finally found something. A small record of a soldier missing in action. The name was the same. Richard felt a chill down his spine. The military file was incomplete, but the mention of a family he had left behind was clear. Driven by the need to know more, Richard began to follow every possible lead. He spent hours looking at old documents, cross-referencing information that slowly started to make sense. It was in a newspaper from a small rural town that he found the missing piece. A brief notice about a soldier who had left for war, leaving behind a pregnant wife. The connection finally formed in his mind. That soldier was Noah's grandfather. The revelation hit Richard with devastating force. That boy he had met by chance at the market, the boy who sold his toy airplane, was the grandson of that soldier. A soldier who never returned, who never met his son. Noah's mother's father. Suddenly everything made sense. The letter, the airplane, the familiar name. Fate had traced a complex path, intertwining the stories of different generations in an inexplicable way. Richard could hardly believe what he had discovered. He abruptly got up from the chair and began pacing the apartment, trying to process it all. Images of Noah and his mother came to his mind. She had never known her father, just as Noah now faced the prospect of losing his mother. The cycle of loss and sacrifice seemed to repeat itself, like a family curse that had not been broken. Richard felt a weight in his chest as he realized the depth of this connection. He sat back down, running his hands through his gray hair, his heart racing. It was impossible to deny the link between him and the history of that family. The toy airplane, which had passed from hand to hand, was now the physical link that connected two generations separated by wars and tragedies. Every detail, from the moment he bought the toy, seemed like a game of fate, as if he had been chosen to uncover this hidden truth. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The memories of the war, the soldier's sacrifice, and his own personal tragedy began to mix in his mind. He remembered his own accident, the moment that took him away from the skies and destroyed his career. And now, here he was, holding a letter written by another man who had also lost everything. The stories, somehow, were connected in ways he did not yet fully understand. Deep down, Richard knew he couldn't just leave this story unfinished. He had been led to this discovery for a reason. Something inside him pushed him to act, to do something about it. Noah, that hopeful boy, deserved to know the truth about his family. His mother, who was fighting illness, also deserved to discover the legacy of a father she never knew. Richard wondered what it would be like to tell her about the letter, about the soldier who sacrificed his life for freedom. As he looked at the toy airplane on the table, Richard felt that fate was pushing him towards a new mission. The weight of the responsibility he felt was almost overwhelming, but there was also a clarity in the path he had to follow. He knew he couldn't go on with his life as before. Something had changed. The past would no longer remain buried. And somehow he knew he was about to change Noah and his mother's lives forever. Richard stayed up all night, sitting in his armchair, staring at the letter on the table in front of him. The silence of the apartment seemed to amplify the turmoil in his mind. The revelation about Noah and his family wouldn't leave his thoughts. He felt caught between the past and the present, as if standing at a crossroads. He knew that once he decided to follow this path, there would be no turning back. The toy airplane, the letter, everything was leading him to something greater. He had to do something, and the weight of that decision was overwhelming. The memories of his own accident began to resurface, involuntarily. Richard saw himself back in that cockpit, the controls firm in his hands, the horizon rushing closer with an impossible speed. The sound of alarms, the violent impact, and then emptiness. Everything had ended there in that moment. His career, his life in the skies, his dreams. He tried to push away those painful memories, but they insisted on returning, like an echo of something he had never managed to overcome. But now, with the letter in hand, Richard felt a new opportunity. Noah's and his mother's pain seemed to mirror his own, a pain of loss, of unfulfilled promises. Only this time, perhaps there was something he could do to change that destiny. He felt that helping Noah was, somehow, his chance for redemption. It was as if the universe was giving him a new mission, something he couldn't ignore. Determined, Richard began to plan his next steps. He needed to find Noah and his mother. Finding their house, understanding more about that family's history, was now his priority. He didn't know exactly what he would say when he found them, but he knew he had to deliver that letter. It was the last piece of the puzzle that Noah and his mother didn't even know existed. And somehow Richard felt it was his responsibility to ensure they received what fate had kept hidden for so long. As the morning approached, Richard had already made his decision. He put on his leather jacket and tucked the letter into the inner pocket, along with the restored toy airplane. The symbolic weight of those objects was almost tangible. Leaving the house, he felt the cold wind on his face, the sun just rising on the horizon. Richard knew that this journey wasn't just about Noah or his mother. It was also about him, about finally finding a way to reconcile the past with the present. As he drove through the city streets, flashes of the accident still invaded his mind. He remembered every detail of that day, how everything changed in a second. The feeling of helplessness that had consumed him ever since. Now, in searching for Noah, there was a chance to rebuild something broken inside him. The inexplicable connection he felt with the boy and his mother was, in a way, his own search for meaning, for redemption. The name of the street where Noah lived was scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper on the passenger seat. Richard picked it up, looking at it with a mixture of anxiety and determination. He didn't know what awaited him at the end of that road, but he knew he couldn't ignore the call. It was as if his entire life had been leading him to this moment, to this family he barely knew, but who now seemed so intrinsically tied to his own destiny. Every mile traveled seemed to carry a greater weight on his shoulders. Richard questioned if he was doing the right thing, if he wasn't invading Noah and his mother's life with painful memories they might prefer to keep buried. But the letter in his pocket was proof that certain stories needed to be told, no matter how difficult they might be. And he was there, ready to be the bearer of those words that had crossed generations. When he finally arrived at the modest neighborhood where Noah and his mother lived, Richard parked the car and took a deep breath. He could see children playing in the streets, the sound of voices and laughter filling the air. But to him, the world seemed silent. Each step toward that house would be an irreversible change, both for him and for that family. With a heavy heart, Richard got out of the car and began to walk, feeling fate guiding him to the meeting that was about to happen. Richard parked the car in front of a modest house, with white walls already worn by time and a small, poorly maintained garden at the entrance. The neighborhood was quiet, but the silence seemed filled with expectation. With his heart racing, he took a deep breath before opening the car door. The letter in the pocket of his jacket weighed like lead, and the restored and gleaming toy airplane in his hands seemed a symbol of something much greater. He had never felt so nervous in his life, as if he were about to cross an invisible line. With each step toward the house's door, Richard felt his anxiety grow. His feet felt heavier than usual, as if fate were holding his legs, asking him to reconsider. But he knew there was no turning back. Standing in front of the simple wooden door, he hesitated for a second before raising his hand and knocking softly. The sound echoed lightly in the surrounding silence. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The door opened slowly, revealing Noah, who looked at Richard in surprise. The boy froze, his eyes widening at the sight of the man standing at his door, holding the toy airplane he had sold. Richard said nothing in the first few seconds. Both stood there, motionless, sharing a silent and profound moment. The tension was palpable in the air. Noah blinked a few times as if trying to confirm that what he saw was real. "I brought it back," Richard murmured, his voice hoarse, extending the airplane toward Noah. The boy, still speechless, stared at the toy as if facing a ghost. "But how?" Noah finally asked, his voice trembling. He couldn't understand how this unknown man was now there, with the object he had sacrificed to help his mother. The airplane, which meant so much to him, now returned under circumstances that seemed shrouded in mystery. Richard, realizing the impact of that moment, gave a small smile. "There's something I need to tell you, something that belongs to your family," he said, trying to ease the tension. Noah looked at Richard's face, trying to understand what was happening. There was a mix of fear and curiosity in the boy's eyes. Richard could see that this encounter meant more to Noah than he had imagined. It wasn't just the return of the toy, it was something much bigger, something that was yet to be revealed. Noah's mother, fragile and with a tired expression, appeared in the background of the house, curious to know who was at the door. "Noah? Who is it?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with concern. Richard took a deep breath again. The sight of the woman, clearly weakened by illness, shook him more than he expected. He felt a tightening in his chest, realizing that time was a cruel enemy. He would need to be quick and clear about what he had discovered before it was too late. My name is Richard," he said, with a slight nod toward the woman. "I bought this airplane from Noah a few days ago. But upon taking it home, I discovered something that you need to know." Noah's mother looked from Richard to the airplane with a confused expression, clearly not understanding where the conversation was headed. Even so, she gave Richard a slight smile, as if wanting to thank him for returning her son's toy. "Please come in," she said, gesturing with her hand for Richard to enter the house. Noah still held the airplane, unable to take his eyes off it, as if reliving every adventure he had imagined while piloting it in his mind. Richard entered the house, feeling the atmosphere heavy with emotions that had not yet been expressed. The simplicity of the setting contrasted with the weight of what was about to be revealed. He knew that by delivering the letter, he would be completely transforming the lives of Noah and his mother. With the letter in his pocket, still untouched, Richard felt a pang of nervousness as he looked at Noah's mother. She looked at him with a calm but visibly exhausted expression. Noah, beside her, held the airplane as if it were a talisman, still not fully understanding what was happening. Richard took a deep breath and prepared to take the next step, the one that would change everything forever. Inside the house, the silence seemed denser, almost tangible. Richard sat in a simple chair at the wooden table, feeling the weight of the letter in the pocket of his jacket. Noah and his mother sat in front of him, their eyes fixed on the toy airplane that now lay on the table. Richard, with a serious and determined look, placed his hand in his pocket and carefully pulled out the folded letter. The air seemed to grow heavier, laden with expectation. "I found this inside the airplane," Richard said in a low but firm voice. He extended the letter towards Noah's mother, who looked at the old paper with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Her fragile hands, trembling slightly, took the letter. She opened the paper slowly, as if sensing that these words held something important. Noah's eyes were attentive, curious about what the letter might reveal. He had never seen his mother so tense. As she read the first lines, her breathing began to change. The words, written by a man she had never known, echoed deep within her heart. It was as if each sentence pulled a thread from the past, revealing a story she had always known existed, but never had the chance to discover. "My dear son," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. A solitary tear slid down her cheek, and her eyes continued to move over the rest of the letter. Noah, still confused, looked at his mother with concern. "What is it, Mom? Who wrote that?" The woman, her voice weak, replied, "It's from my father, the father I never knew." The revelation fell like a bombshell. Noah was in shock. He had never heard his mother speak about his grandfather. It was an absence that had always been there, but one that no one mentioned. Richard remained silent, watching the impact those words had on the family. He knew he was only beginning to reveal the depth of that secret. Her trembling hands clutched the letter as she continued reading, each line more loaded with emotion than the last. The soldier, the man who had been her father, wrote about his fears of never coming home, about the regret of not knowing the child he loved so much. She swallowed hard, feeling the pain of the absence of a father who could never be present. But at the same time, she felt an inexplicable connection to the man whose words now filled the void of a lifetime. I always knew he died in the war, she finally said, looking at Noah and Richard, her voice breaking with tears. But I never knew he left something. I never knew he tried to reach me. What was once a vague idea about a lost father now materialized into written words, into a letter that had crossed time and silence to reach her. And there, in that moment, all the absence she had felt took on a new meaning. The room seemed to breathe with them, each processing what had just been revealed. Richard, who had remained in the background until then, felt compelled to say something. I don't know how this letter ended up inside the airplane, but I knew it belonged to you. It belonged to your story. Noah, speechless, looked at the toy airplane as if it were now a sacred object, loaded with meanings he was still trying to understand. Noah's mother looked at Richard, her eyes still filled with tears, but now with gratitude. You don't know what this means to me, to us, she said, her voice low but sincere. This letter fills a space I didn't even know could be filled. Richard felt a lump in his throat. He knew that this was only the beginning of the story they needed to hear. The past, which was now unfolding before them, was not just revealing secrets. It was connecting lives in ways no one could have predicted. The silence in the room was almost absolute. The letter still rested in Noah's mother's hands, its words carrying an emotional weight almost unbearable. But Richard knew there was more to be said, more to be revealed. He felt his heart heavy and for a moment, wished he didn't have to bring up what he was about to share. He shifted in the chair, the nervousness beginning to take hold, but he knew it was time to connect the missing pieces. There's something else, something I need to tell you, he said, his voice slightly trembling. Noah and his mother raised their eyes to Richard, the silence between them dense and laden with expectation. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and began to speak. The accident that ended my career, the one that took me away from the skies forever, was not an ordinary accident. It was the same incident in which your grandfather, the soldier who wrote this letter, lost his life in a heroic sacrifice. The words hung in the air as if time had stopped at that exact moment. Noah's eyes widened in shock, and his mother put her hand to her mouth, barely believing what she was hearing. What? She murmured, her voice weak, almost inaudible. Richard looked at them, feeling the weight of that revelation. He knew the connections were deep, deeper than he could have imagined. I was piloting a rescue mission, he continued, a secret military mission where we were ambushed by enemies. Your grandfather, he was there and he sacrificed himself to save the rest of us. Richard's words were like a slow exploding bomb, dismantling the invisible barriers between past and present. Noah looked at him, incredulous, trying to process the information. His grandfather, the man he never knew, had been a hero, and Richard, the man sitting in front of him, had witnessed the final act of his bravery. I never knew his name until now. Everything happened so fast. We never knew who the soldier was that saved us until I read this letter. Richard's memories returned with full force. The sound of the propellers, the screams on the radio, the spreading fire as he tried to control the falling airplane. He felt his hands sweating, his body tense as if he were back in that moment. His sacrifice, it was what allowed me to survive. He stayed behind, ensuring that the enemy wouldn't reach us, even knowing it would cost him his life. The room was engulfed in such intense tension that it seemed like no one could breathe. Noah's mother, with tears in her eyes, looked at Richard with a mixture of pain and gratitude. Knowing that her father had been a hero brought a peace she didn't expect to feel, but at the same time, the tragedy of his sacrifice was hard to bear. So, my father saved your life, she murmured, still trying to understand what that meant. Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Yes, he responded, his voice choked with emotion. He saved my life, and I never knew who he was until now. Noah remained silent, the emotions overwhelming his young heart. The idea that his grandfather had sacrificed himself to save other lives hit him with an unexpected force. He looked at the toy airplane on the table, which now seemed to represent much more than his childhood dreams. It was a symbol of a connection he could never have imagined. A legacy of courage and sacrifice that now united everyone there in an indestructible way. Richard felt he had finally told the truth, a truth that had long been hidden in the shadows of the past. I lost control of the airplane after he saved us. I crashed and it took me away from the skies forever. I never flew again after that day. but knowing that his sacrifice was what gave me the chance to go on living. Brought me here, to you. The emotion in his voice was palpable, each word carrying a sincerity that touched everyone deeply. The past and the present intertwined in an inextricable way, connecting those three people through a tragedy and a sacrifice that changed all their lives. And as silence filled the room once more, Richard knew that in that moment, something profoundly significant had been revealed. There were no more secrets, no more uncertainties, only the truth and the strength to move forward together, carrying the legacy of love and courage that united them. Richard remained silent for a few moments after revealing the tragic connection that intertwined their lives. The weight of that discovery still hung in the air, like a dense shadow over everyone in the room. He looked at Noah and his mother, who, despite the pain, now also carried something new, a sense of pride and belonging to the heroic story of a man who sacrificed everything. But Richard knew that the truth, as powerful as it was, wasn't enough. He felt within him an uncontrollable need to do more. There was an unpaid debt, a cycle that needed to be closed. Looking at the woman in front of him, visibly weakened in health, Richard realized that time was a luxury that family did not have. Her father's sacrifice had saved lives in the past, and now Richard faced a rare opportunity. He could do something to save her life in the present. It wasn't just a matter of guilt but of honor. A gesture that could finally redeem part of the pain he had carried for so long. Taking a deep breath, Richard leaned forward, his expression determined. I know I can't change what happened in the past, but there's something I can do now. Noah and his mother watched him attentively, not knowing what he was about to say. I want to pay for your mother's treatment. Whatever is necessary, all the doctors and medications. I'll take care of it. You don't need to worry anymore. Noah's mother remained silent, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if she were trying to process what she had just heard. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Noah looked at Richard with a mix of amazement and gratitude, unable to believe what was happening. Richard knew that the gesture, though grand, was not about money. It was about something much greater. It was his way of honoring Noah's grandfather's sacrifice and finally, doing something concrete to help. You don't have to say anything, Richard replied softly with a small smile. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. And because I feel that, somehow, I'm here because of what your father did. The atmosphere lightened, but the depth of the moment continued to echo. It was an act of redemption, of healing. Not just for Richard, but for everyone present. Noah's mother let out a sob, trying to hold back the tears. I never imagined that someone could help us like this, she said, her voice choked with emotion. You've already given us so much with the truth about my father. And now this. Her gratitude was genuine, but there was also a hint of disbelief in her tone, as if she was still trying to accept the kindness that had entered her life at that moment. Noah, beside her, finally spoke. Thank you, Richard. I don't know how to repay you. His voice carried the weight of a boy who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but also the relief of seeing a light at the end of the tunnel. Richard looked at the boy, feeling a deep connection. You don't have to repay anything, Noah. Just keep dreaming. It's what your grandfather would have wanted. The silence that followed was filled with meaning. Noah's mother wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and smiled, for the first time in a long time. It was a smile of hope, of relief. Richard knew that this was the beginning of a new journey for them and for him. And for the first time in many years, he felt that he was, indeed, making peace with the past, not only for himself but for all those who had suffered the consequences of that accident. When Richard left the house that day, the burden he had carried for so long seemed to have finally been lightened. He knew there was still much to be done, but the first step had been taken. The cycle of sacrifice and loss that connected his life to Noah and his mother's now had the chance to be broken. There was hope where before there was only pain, and that hope would be nurtured. A gesture of redemption that would change the fate of that family forever. The days that followed Richard's offer were transformative. Noah's mother began her treatment almost immediately, and the improvement was surprising. With each new appointment, hope grew a little more. Before, her frailty was evident in every movement, in every word whispered with effort. Now, as the medications and specialized care began to take effect, color returned to her face and the light to her eyes. For Noah, seeing his mother become the strong woman he had known was like living a dream he no longer dared to imagine. With his mother's recovery, the atmosphere in the house changed drastically. The air, once heavy with worry and silence, was now filled with laughter and conversations about the future. Noah, who had long carried the weight of uncertainty and responsibility, could finally breathe easier. The bond between him and Richard also grew stronger with each visit the former pilot made. Richard, who had kept himself distant from the world for so long, now found a renewed purpose in witnessing the transformation of that family. One day, while Noah's mother was resting after a treatment session, Richard arrived with a carefully wrapped box. Noah, curious, greeted him with a shy smile. "I have something for you," Richard said, his gaze gentle but full of meaning. Noah looked at the box with wide eyes, feeling that inside was more than just a simple object. When he finally opened it, what he saw left him speechless. His old toy airplane, completely restored. Every detail of the airplane was perfect. The propellers, once worn and crooked, now spun smoothly. The paint, once faded, had been redone with precision, bringing back the metallic shine Noah remembered so well. He ran his fingers over the toy carefully, as if touching an important part of his own past. You fixed it," he whispered, his voice breaking. Richard nodded with a smile. "This airplane is more than just a toy, Noah. It carries your dreams, and I think it's time for you to keep dreaming." Noah held the airplane as if it were something sacred. That small object, which he had sold in a moment of despair, now represented far more than his childhood adventures. It represented everything he could still become, everything that was yet to come. His eyes glistened, and he looked at Richard, feeling a gratitude he couldn't express in words. Richard knew what that moment meant, not only for Noah but also for himself. It was a cycle coming to a close, a dream restored, just like the life he had helped save. Noah's mother, watching from a distance, saw the scene with tears in her eyes. She knew how much that airplane meant to her son. Seeing Noah hold it with that sparkle in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time, made her heart fill with hope. Her physical recovery was progressing, but the greatest healing for her was seeing her son dream again. Seeing the burden he had carried being lifted. Richard stood up and placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, feeling the bond between them grow even stronger. "This airplane belongs to you, Noah, and it's going to take you to places you can't even imagine." "I know it." Noah nodded, unable to speak. He knew that the gesture was more than just returning a toy. It was the return of his faith in the future, his belief that even amid pain there was always room to dream and grow. From that day on, Noah began to imagine his future with clarity again. He was no longer a boy who merely survived, who sold his treasures to save his mother. Now he was someone who could dream of freedom once more. The carefully restored toy airplane was a silent promise that his dreams were still alive, ready to take off when the time came. As for Richard, he felt lighter with each step he took to help that family. He too had been restored in some way, finding a purpose that had long eluded him. Each time he saw Noah holding the airplane or heard the laughter of the boy's mother, he knew that Noah's grandfather's sacrifice had not been in vain. The cycle of pain and loss was finally being broken, and in its place, a new hope was emerging, for Noah, his mother, and unexpectedly for Richard as well. The morning sun reflected off the wings of the airplanes lined up along the runway as Noah walked across the tarmac with firm steps, his heart beating strongly in his chest. Dressed in his cadet uniform, the 18-year-old felt the weight of that moment. He was about to fulfill the dream that had accompanied him since childhood, the same one that had been driven by his grandfather's sacrifice and Richard's generous gesture. Now, with each step, he moved toward the future he had always imagined, a future in the skies. The wind hit his face, bringing with it memories of the days when he played with the toy airplane, flying imaginary missions in his room. But now it was no longer a fantasy. He was there, for real, about to climb into the cockpit of a real airplane, the same cockpit his grandfather once dreamed of seeing his son occupy. As he looked to the horizon, Noah felt a mix of excitement and calm. He knew that this moment was the beginning of something greater, something he was destined to do. When he finally reached the airplane, the sound of the propellers turning slowly made him smile. Noah looked at the massive metal bird in front of him and for a moment, felt as if he were home. The cockpit awaited him like a natural extension of who he was. Every detail, every button, was a piece of the puzzle he had been assembling for years. His grandfather's legacy, a soldier who had given his life for others, was alive within him. And now, he had the chance to honor that legacy in a way he never imagined possible. As he climbed the steps to the cockpit, Noah felt something familiar and comforting. It was as if Richard and his grandfather were there with him, watching his every move. He knew that, in a way, he was not alone. The presence of both was almost tangible, as if their sacrifices and stories were guiding him to this exact moment. It was a cycle coming to a close, a journey about to begin, but one that, at the same time, brought the piece of something that finally fit. Before entering the cockpit, Noah paused for a moment and looked up at the clear blue sky. He remembered Richard, everything the man had done for him and his mother. Richard had given him back more than just a toy. He had restored his hope, his dream, and his faith that the impossible could become reality. Noah knew that Richard's sacrifice, although not a matter of life or death, had saved his mother's life and in a way his own as well. With one last deep breath, Noah entered the cockpit, feeling the soft leather of the seat beneath him and the firmness of the yoke in his hands. He adjusted the controls with the precision of someone who had prepared for this moment his entire life. The instructor beside him gave the signal to begin the takeoff procedures, but before following the orders, Noah closed his eyes for a second. In his mind, he heard the voice of his grandfather, the man he had never known, and Richard, the man who had become his family. Both, in some way, were there with him. Noah opened his eyes and smiled. He was ready. As he began the takeoff, the airplane started moving slowly down the runway, the sound of the engines filling the air. Every second was a mix of excitement and focus, but Noah was prepared. He had been preparing his whole life for this moment. When the airplane finally left the ground and soared toward the sky, he felt an indescribable lightness, as if he were flying not just for himself, but for everyone who had guided him to that point. As he ascended higher and higher, Noah looked out the window, the vast horizon stretching out before him. The sky, the same one he had dreamed of conquering as a child, was now his. And in that moment, he knew he had fulfilled his destiny. His grandfather's journey, Richard's sacrifice, everything his mother had endured, every part of that story was in some way connected to this flight. Noah now carried all of them with him, and he knew that no matter what the future held, he was ready to face it. Gradually, the plane leveled off at high altitude, and Noah allowed himself to smile, feeling the air lighter around him. He knew that although this was only the beginning of his career as a pilot, it was also the end of a long emotional journey that involved sacrifice, resilience, and redemption. Reaching the clouds, Noah finally felt that he was where he had always been meant to be, between the sky and the earth, where dreams could come true. And so, with a heart at peace, Noah flew, knowing that his grandfather and Richard in some way would always be by his side, guiding him toward this new horizon that lay ahead. The story of sacrifice, love, and redemption had come to an end, and at the same time, made way for a new beginning. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Noah and Richard, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love touching stories and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next moving story.